Hello, humans. I've been translating a book and I came across some passages about smallpox. So even though that's not a relevant topic for today, I had to kind of research it a bit in order to understand some of the things in translation, some of the words. I wasn't sure what they were referring to and so forth. I spent a couple days researching smallpox, and I thought it was interesting enough to make a video. But if you only want practical stuff, then maybe this isn't the video for you. This is kind of theoretically interesting, but smallpox isn't a problem anymore. So anyway, let's talk then about smallpox and vaccination and what it was like in China in the early 20th century. It's not at all like vaccinations today. And yeah, so let's see what's going on here. First, though, we have to understand, a little bit about smallpox because since it's been eradicated for more than 40 years, and even before that, I think most of us were never around people with smallpox, maybe we don't have as much information. So I'll go through this part quickly. Of course, you can Google stuff to find out about the Western medicine point of view, and then I'll get to the Chinese medicine stuff. So smallpox was incredibly deadly. It killed at least 1 in 3 people, and sometimes some outbreaks, some strains of it maybe were more potent and it would kill more, or maybe if the population was not real healthy. So, like, wow, killing 1 in 3 people, that's a pretty serious condition. And it's the only human disease that has been eradicated. We haven't achieved that with anything else. So, I mean, look at these. This is horrible all over your body. And yeah, it's not just these sores, but, there's stuff going on inside too. So the symptoms would include high fever, vomiting, sores in the mouth, and then these lesions all over the whole body. It's kind of something like chicken pox, only much more serious. It's got like these blisters that fill with pus and so forth. And people might die within 2 weeks. Survivors, might be blind if it affected the eyes, or infertile, or other kinds of problems. And of course, the pock marks on the face. How would you like to go through the rest of your life with your face like that? I mean, that's not the most serious in terms of health, but it's just horrible to look that way. You must be kind of embarrassed to go out in public or meet new people. So um, the ancient Chinese and other peoples figured out something that's called variolation. Variola is a name for smallpox. So variolation is this method that actually uses smallpox to get immunity with only more mild disease. At least that's theoretically true. So this was widely used in East Asia, like China and so forth. And also it apparently arose independently in some parts of Africa. And so they would take a small amount of material from a smallpox sore, which is pussy and stuff like that, and transfer it to healthy people. And then if you get sick that way, you're going to have a milder disease than if you get infection because somebody's coughing, or you eat after somebody who's sick with it or something like that. And much lower mortality rate, but it's still not totally safe because sometimes people would get a serious illness from it. But still, the odds were more in your favor doing that. And so while you read that in the Song Dynasty it was being used, but actually the evidence is not very certain for that. And hold on. Sorry, I had to clear my throat. But definitely in the Ming Dynasty in the mid 1500s, we know this was happening. And while here, this is stuff I stole from the internet, it mentions one method, but there are actually four methods. So insufflation means blowing something up the nose. And so they would take the scabs from smallpox and like dry them and grind it into a fine powder and blow it into the nostrils. There's also a wet method where they would, have it still moist and wipe it on the inside of the nostrils. And then there's another method where they would have usually it was a child, they would have the child wear the clothes from another child who had smallpox. But that one seemed to be less effective at transferring the disease. And I forget what the fourth method was, but this is probably the most effective method. One of the problems is that, this powder might not, it has a shelf life. And so if you've had it for too long, it might not be active anymore. This method, first off, you can't count on it because it may not be so active. And secondly, you could get really sick from it because this is actually smallpox virus in it, although they wouldn't have known it was virus. So apparently, this idea made its way into Turkey and places in the Ottoman Empire. And a woman who was with her husband was like a diplomat or something like that. She observed it and she brought the idea back to England and started talking about it. And also in the American colonies, it was found that some West Africans had been using this practice, from when they were still in Africa. And so one of the enslaved, I don't know how you pronounce his name. Apparently it's a Greek name. It was some Greek person, Onesimus. But an enslaved person told his so-called owner, his enslaver, who was named Cotton Mather, about it. And so Cotton Mather publicized it, and then it was used for an outbreak of smallpox in Massachusetts in 1721. So that's kind of interesting. And so what happened though is like Jenner heard about, this kind of thing. Edward Jenner was a famous doctor in England. And he also heard the rumor that people who had gotten cowpox wouldn't get smallpox. So if you were, a person who worked with cattle, and apparently cowpox is a disease that cattle get, and there's also horsepox, and today we've heard of monkeypox. But if you get it, you have a mild disease and you have a few sores, but like it heals over and people don't die from it, generally speaking. So he took stuff from a cowpox sore and scratched it into a healthy 8-year-old. And then the 8-year-old felt sick for a few days, but recovered. And then 2 months later, Jenner scratched some smallpox material into him. Great ethics, right? But he didn't get sick. And so that's the beginning of Jenner's vaccination. And that was done. So before they called it variolation or inoculation, and now it's called vaccination, and vaca means cow, because it comes from cowpox, not smallpox, so there's less risk of serious illness. But what they had to do is like cut a little, cut into the person's flesh and then put some of this stuff in the cut. It wasn't an injection like we have today. So this was called arm-to-arm vaccination because you needed, somebody with a cowpox sore. or somebody who had just been vaccinated, because at the site of the vaccination, you get a sore. And so you can take material from the vaccination site sore and put it into the next person. So it's not literally two arms being pressed together, but it's not really stored in between. They played with storing it, but again, they had problems with keeping it active. So this is also called humanized vaccination. And one of the problems with it is that some diseases could be passed through, like syphilis. Try explaining that to your spouse. Oh, I got syphilis from my vaccination. No, I don't think so. Anyway, so there had to be an unbroken chain. And if nobody had cowpox, if there was no cow with cowpox, if nobody had recently been vaccinated, then you couldn't vaccinate. So this is a picture from China. This says a implanting pox knife or a planting pox knife. They called it planting, like you plant seeds. Yeah, so that's a knife for making a cut. And then they, in China, did cuts in more than one place. You can see this person had 4 places where they planted the pox. And one source I read said that some people recommended certain points on the Sanjiao channel, points on the upper arm on the Sanjiao channel. I don't know if it matters, but that's what they said. So let's look at the typical progression. And this was part of my problem, was in translation. The vocabulary that was being used isn't modern Western terminology only in Chinese language, but it was like kind of a terminology that's no longer used. And so some of it I had to figure out, what do they mean by that? So after you've made the cut and you've poked the hole and you put some of the cowpox junk in, then first thing is there's a papule or a raised red bump will form within 3 to 5 days. And so that here, this says a red spot is how I took to be this stage. And then there's a vesicle, which means it's like a water blister. And they use this term li, which is like a grain of rice or a grain of something. But it took me a while to figure out that this was meaning a vesicle, which develops into a blister. The bump develops into a blister after about 5 to 8 days. And then it, turns into pus. And there's really, like, if you look at pictures, it's really a pussy sore. Yeah, it doesn't look pleasant. And so it becomes filled with pus. And they're using this word jiang, which means like sauce, or paste, or like, if you're cooking, you might use some kind of sauce. And that's often this word jiang. And so that took me a while to figure out that they're meaning like the pussy stuff from the sore that they're using to implant in the next person. And then it scabs over, and then the scab falls off after 14 to 21 days, and then there's a depressed scar. And, you saw in the picture of the person's face after he had smallpox, and, so there's this like pit in the site, but that's better than having those pits all over your body. Also, if this type of Jenner cowpox vaccination was used, these are the symptoms. The arm would be sore and red at the injection site. They might get swollen lymph nodes, fever, but generally not very high, and then headache, body ache, fatigue, and so forth. And about 1 in 3 would have more serious symptoms, but, most of them would just, it doesn't sound that much different than after you get a flu shot today, maybe a little more serious. And there can also be itching at the vaccination site. So Jenner's method, this method was used until the 1950s. They were, doing this until the 1950s when they had better production techniques and they learned how to like stabilize, the vaccine so that it could be stored. And by 1980, the World Health Organization said smallpox is eradicated. So I'm sorry, that's like 10 slides of kind of mostly not about Chinese view, but now the rest of this is all about the Chinese point of view. Okay. Or Japanese. So, I found there's a site that you can search, using keywords that has a lot of old texts, some that are not so old. 1936 is not that old. But like I found some information in a Japanese text from the early 20th century that, kind of explains more plainly what exactly is going on. And so this Japanese doctor says the method uses a needle to prick both arms. So they're pricking in more than one place. The pus, here they're actually using the word pus, is inserted into the opening that's left by the needle, but you don't want any blood to come out because you're trying to push in. You don't want it coming out. The number of insertions depends on the age of the person, although he doesn't explain, how many at what age. So here's a picture. Here's some kind of needle. It looks like an acupuncture needle, but probably a little thicker. And it's making a hole. This is supposed to be a hole in somebody's skin. And putting some pus in. And this picture is supposed to be like different places on the same person they implanted. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, maybe 9. That's a lot of places that they did it. They really wanted to make sure, I guess, that it took. So that's a little description of how it was done in China or Japan. And then here's a Chinese doctor around the same time period saying, recently cowpox vaccination has been introduced. Its symptoms are relatively mild. 1 or 2 days after somebody's vaccinated, there'll be slight redness and swelling locally. This gradually becomes raised and forms paste. Remember, I told you, well, this literally says pus paste. Around the 10th day, the pus paste is fully formed. And after this, it gradually dries up and becomes a dimple. There's like a depression that's left afterwards. Around the 20th day, the scab drops off. During this time period, there may be fever. Sometimes it's a high fever, sometimes not, but it lasts a week at the most. So that's kind of a description of what to expect if you were getting a cowpox vaccination. He goes on to say the best time to get this vaccination is between 6 and 10 months, for an infant. After that, they had to give the vaccination. They were giving the vaccination every 3 to 5 years. So it wasn't a one-time thing like it became later. I don't know if that was because they just wanted to make sure, or if somehow using cowpox doesn't give you as long immunity as later vaccinations. I don't know, but boosters every 3 to 5 years. During the vaccination period, you should pay attention to keeping the site clean. Don't allow it to break open. There's a water blister vesicle, and then there's a pustule, and you want it to stay intact. Many days of dietary restrictions are especially necessary. We'll see more about diet later in this slideshow. First, you must avoid breaking the vesicle or pustule open, and then it could become a sore, apparently, that maybe has a harder time healing or leaves more of a scar. And second, you have to avoid leaving residual toxins behind after the vaccination, which would make it ineffective. So we have to talk about these residual toxins. And so what they're referring to is fetal toxins. So some of you may be aware of fetal toxins and some of you not so much, because that's kind of one of the things that's not talked about so much today, although it's talked about in the old pediatric books. So here we're going to talk about. So we have to understand fetal toxins before we can understand the smallpox and the vaccine thing that's going on. So this fetal toxin, like this is literally the fetus, and this is the word toxin, like a herb that has toxicity, or like fire toxins, stuff like that. It's the same word. So the very first pediatric book totally on pediatrics, not on anything else, is a Song Dynasty book by a doctor named Chen Yi. And he says, the child spends 10 lunar months as a fetus, eating, consuming, absorbing the blood and filth of the 5 organs. Once born, the toxins need to erupt or come out, be pushed out. So there's this situation of sores and rashes. And so basically the idea is as the body's pushing the toxins out, it becomes these rashy childhood diseases like measles, and chicken pox and smallpox. Okay. And all of this is related to, there's jin and there's ye. The ye are some of the fluids of the body. So this is related to the fluids of the 5 zang organs. The liver governs tears, the lungs govern nasal mucus, the heart governs blood. This, we also know sweat, but here he says blood. Excuse me. And the spleen is the binder of blood. So then there are 5 types of sores that come out. The liver is going to make water blisters like chicken pox or something like that using tears. So the water, why are they water blisters? Because tears are the fluid of the liver, and they're also greenish and small. The lungs make pustules, dense and turbid like nasal mucus, so they're large and white. The heart makes macules and the spleen makes papules. So just in case, you can palpate papules. That's how I remember. Papules have bumps and macules are smooth, but spots. Okay. So the heart governs blood. And so, the macules are red and small, and they're smaller than water blisters. And the spleen makes papules, but this word Jun can mean rashes in general. It can actually also refer to measles. And so anyway, and then the kidneys, it says that in the initial stage, the kidneys don't have one of those initial types, but there can be symptoms of kidneys. And if there's cold in the sacral region or in the ears, which both belong to the kidneys, this has to do with kidneys and north and coldness. And so if the previous sores become black and sunken, and if the ears and sacral region become hot, then that's the kidney type, and that's not a good sign. Okay, so that's the first thing about fetal toxins. And so now that you have an idea, the fetus is like in the uterus for all that time, and there are no windows, and the door is shut for 10 months. And so they absorb just, junk. And so they have these toxins that need to come out if they want to stay healthy. And so then these rashy diseases erupt, which means the fetal toxins are coming out. Okay. So now back to the smallpox vaccine in Chinese sources or Japanese sources, that one Japanese source that I quoted from before. Here's this Japanese person. Smallpox toxins are rooted in the embryonic fetal toxins. They're triggered by seasonal qi, meaning weather qi. So what happens, this is a standard theory, what happens is the baby has these toxins in them, and then they get a wind attack, a wind heat attack, which triggers the fetal toxins to start being expressed. And that's why we use herbs to promote expression of rash in that kind of disease. We don't try to suppress the rash, we try to make it express, because that's the toxins actually being pushed out of the body. kind of like the idea in gua sha, the sha stuff is like bad stuff that's coming out through the skin. That kind of idea. So, therefore, he says the technique of vaccination is not a simple, easy matter. I've tried it, I've seen its effects. But if somebody has deep pre-heaven toxins, like fetal toxins, it can leave behind huge injuries. This guy, actually, he's an anti-vaxxer, kind of, but we can talk about that when we finish his passage. Fetal toxins lie dormant in the five zang, and they're triggered by contact with evils like wind and heat. If there's no contact with these evils, it's not triggered. When it's triggered, then it will develop rapidly. So the toxins come from the organs, and they stir up the organ qi. These toxins are totally dependent on blood and qi to carry the body is totally dependent on blood and qi to carry the toxins out of the body and transform it into this pus, the sores. He's talking about smallpox here. He's using that word jiang, which is, like I said, a sauce in cooking and stuff like that. And so it needs your own body's qi and blood to turn the toxins into this pus on the surface of the body and push them out, and then also close the sore back up into a scab and so forth. And only then can the Zangfu be at peace when they get rid of those toxins. Because remember, the toxins store up the true qi of these organs. So you have to get rid of the toxins for the organs to be at peace. If blood and qi can't carry the toxic qi out, the toxic qi is going to attack the organs instead. So he says, yeah, this theory makes sense. It's enough to tell us that smallpox is indeed caused by fetal toxins. And then he starts talking about the fetal toxins. Men's jing and women's jing blend to form a fetus at conception. The father's jing belongs to qi, and the mother's jing belongs to blood. The father's jing manifests as papules, and the mother's jing manifests as smallpox. Okay. So when the toxins are triggered and manifest, the body can become peaceful. Getting rid of that stuff is like a cicada shedding its skin, or like a plant shedding its husk. Okay. And then that guy goes on to say that if you are vaccinated, then you don't really get all that stuff out, and it's not natural, and that we should follow the way of nature. Okay, so we don't have to agree with that. That's, one person's opinion, but lots of other people, thought vaccines were okay. And we'll keep talking about this. So that's my background from other doctors. Zheng Yi is the doctor I was translating when I came across this, stuff about smallpox and needed to figure out more background in order to translate it better. I'm still working on the translation. It may not be perfect yet, but it's getting better because I understand a little bit more. And so she wrote this book. It has 2 volumes on medicine, and one of them includes a section on pediatrics, and that's where we come across the smallpox thing. And then she has 1 volume on women's education, and she, in that she talks about child rearing, and there she talks about smallpox again. So here's from the medical chapters. And again, this is a picture of somebody who's been vaccinated in multiple places, I guess to make sure it takes. And she says in 1907, and she has a lot of Western influence, but not totally. She thinks that Western medicine is good at some stuff, but overall Chinese medicine is better. And so she, incorporates some Western ideas like, sanitation, vaccination, and so forth. So she says, pediatric smallpox, we don't have to discuss it anymore because now we have a vaccine, a cowpox vaccine. And she says the vaccine doesn't damage original chi, UN chi, and you don't need to take medicine. Like if you get sick, you have to take medicine, you know. Yeah. If the parents procrastinate and do not vaccinate with cowpox early, they're harming their own child because their child could get smallpox and have died or have serious side effects. But after being vaccinated with cowpox, a rashy condition will soon appear. It will appear more than a month after being vaccinated, up to a year. If it appears before this time frame, it's not the true rash that she's looking for. Only if it appears during this time frame can we consider the residual toxins from fetal toxins or possibly from the vaccine. Only if this rash appears between a month and a year afterwards, only then can we think that all the fetal toxins have been pushed out. So here I have some problem with this. And maybe if some of you, have information, you can help me, by posting in the comments or something. But here's my problem. Remember that when you're vaccinated, everything by 2 weeks should pretty much, be done. And so this is saying the rash has to appear more than a month after being vaccinated. So they're not talking about the sore. She's not talking about the sore that arises at the vaccination site. She's talking about a rash that occurs later. And so what is that rash? You don't read about that as being a side effect of the vaccine. And so here's what I'm thinking is that if you have the vaccine, maybe you get rid of some toxins because it makes pus, but maybe that's just the toxins of the vaccine. And so the child still has fetal toxins. All the fetal toxins have not yet been pushed out. And so you still need a rashy childhood disease to push those toxins out. And so I'm wondering if in terms of Western medicine, what's going on is that the child gets, measles or some other condition sometime after a month and before a year from the smallpox vaccine, just coincidentally. And now that is what actually gets rid of the fetal toxins. Because, if you have a vaccine and then you don't get a big rash, you're not expressing the fetal toxins, they're still inside. So this is what I think at this point is that, she's, it's kind of coincidence from a modern point of view, but she's thinking that somehow the vaccine is going to cause a later rash so the fetal toxins can come out. At the time the rash appears, first they'll have a runny nose, the eyes will be tearing, watering, there'll be chills and fever or cough and sore throat. You have to be careful of wind and cold. And also watch your diet, avoid oily, salty, like pungent, spicy kind of stuff or fishy smelling food. When this arises, this rash that happens a month to a year afterwards, then she gives you a formula to take. And so here's the formula to help express the rash. We know herbs like shengma, do help express rashes. So you can see dangui supplements. We've got some anti-wind herbs, but we've also got some herbs that deal more internally. Yeah. Okay, there's the formula. And remember, this is for a child, so, be careful with dosing. It's not high doses of anything. Also, if the rash is not fully expressed, then boil 1 large handful of green onions and cilantro, a handful of each, in water and rice wine. It doesn't say, but it may be like 1 cup of water, 1 cup of rice wine, 50-50, and dip a cloth. I don't know if it matters that it's made from this material that's called, is it pronounced rami? It's got this same ma word in it that, for madza, which is this rash. Anyway, So they're not drinking this, but you're rubbing the body, including the five hearts, the palms, the soles, and the center of the chest, and then the rash will come out. Okay, so and then the rash comes out, and then that means the toxins are out of the body, the fetal toxins. Okay, so she also has a section on women's education. And so in the section on medicine, she talks in pretty technical terms. And the section on women's education is more like she's talking to, a random mother who doesn't necessarily know a lot about medicine. She says the best period for vaccination is between 70 days after birth up to 6 months. That's not too different from what the other doctor said before. Vaccinate the child again after 6 months if they don't get vesicles to erupt or if only one or two erupt. So this bothered me at first until I found out that they, vaccinated you in multiple places on the body. So, if one place erupts or two places erupt, that may not be enough of a response. But if you do it, we saw a picture with 9 times, if 7 of them erupt, then that's a better response. Vaccination will prevent the suffering of heaven current epidemics. That just means epidemics. In all the countries, East and West, regardless of age, vaccination is done once a year or once every 2 years. We saw the other text said, which is like 30 years later, the other text said every 3 to 5 years. Okay. So, but again, we have confirmation that they were revaccinating. This is most beneficial for health. The pace, the jiang, what's the word, syrup, the sauce, the pus sauce, meaning the pus from another child's cowpox sore, that, when you take it from another child, it has to be fresh and it has to be from a healthy child. Okay, so don't take it from a child that's generally sickly or weak or that's very sick at the moment. Take it from a healthy child who's just been vaccinated. By looking at this is a footnote and somehow it got stuck with the rest of it. So this, where it says by looking at other contemporaneous sources on smallpox, then I figured out the word Li means the vesicle stage. Before the pus stage. Anyway, so there's footnotes. I should have taken these footnotes out here because I already explained this stuff. Sorry, there's extra stuff on this slide. She goes on to say, for the first 3 days after being vaccinated, you should eat vegetarian diffusing food, which is Weissman's term, but this word means outward movement because you're trying to promote expression, of the sores and the toxins to come towards the surface. And then she lists tofu skin, which is a thing, fragrant mushrooms, which may refer to shiitake, but it's not exactly the same name as shiitake. Spring bamboo shoots, winter bamboo shoots, daylily, Chinese cabbage, and winter mushrooms, which that one does refer to dried shiitake. So this may mean fresh shiitake versus dried shiitake mushrooms, or this xiangjun may be something else. Soybeans, tofu, those are the things, and vegetarian food for the first 3 days. Then once the red spot appears, which 3 days is within the right time period, then you should eat bird's nest soup and certain type of carp and chicken soup made from a hen, not a rooster. In, Chinese culture, they eat roosters too. You should always eat a lot of crucian carp to assist the pus paste in forming, to assist it to form. Yeah. When the pus paste is, adequate and, your body is reacted enough, and when it's about to start to heal, you should avoid the food that has outward movement because now you want the sore to contract. you're done pushing things out. And so it says literally pork loin, but apparently this phrase can also mean kidneys. Actually, it doesn't have the word pork, but that's what they're talking about. So that might be pork kidneys or pork loin, tripe, lean meat, cabbage, and so forth. Avoid oily, salty, fried foods. Eating light and bland is the best when you're, recovering from the vaccination. Roosters and carp have to be avoided for a year. Before, she wanted us to eat a certain type of carp. Now I don't know if we have to avoid all carp or what, but anyway. And beef and cherries should be avoided for 3 years. Wow. I think these are hot things. Anyway, if you can eat this way, the toxins will be completely pushed out and you'll never get this disease of smallpox. If the child is breastfeeding, the mother should also eat this way. After the smallpox vaccine, you should take 1 or 2 doses of a toxin vanquishing medicine. The phrase here is Baidu. So some of you may know Baidu San or Renchen Baidu San or other formulas that have Baidu San in their name. So that's what she's talking about to help, again, detox. Detox in a Chinese way, not in a modern way of talking. Okay. So that's that. If you have any clues to help me improve my understanding, please do let me know. I have a little postscript. This was in an earlier video, but I have a lot of videos. Maybe you didn't see it. Just in case, Ge Hong, who wrote Zhou Beiji Fang, really famous doctor, it's said by some people that he had the earliest description of smallpox in the whole world. A description of smallpox that we can recognize. Oh, yeah, that sounds like smallpox. Well, I'm not so sure for a couple of reasons, but I have 2 more slides. Let's see what he had to say. In past years, a disease has been going around. Sounds like it's a new disease to him. Again and again, sores erupt on the head, the face, and the body. They're soon seen all over the body, appearing like fire sores. In other words, they're very red. We saw a picture before. They look pretty red before. All these sores are capped with milky fluid, which is like the pus paste. It may be a little different than regular pus from a boil or something like that. Maybe that's why they're calling it a paste. Anyway. More are engendered after they burst. So, the vesicle or whatever pops and then, more come. If not quickly treated, many who have serious disease will die. After someone has been treated and recovered, the sores leave purple-black scars, which decrease over the years. This is a malign toxic qi. Well, so I don't have a picture of like a newly recovered pockmark from smallpox. I don't know if they're black in the beginning, but then the color may fade until they're the same color skin tone, but still pockmark. So people say this is first mention of smallpox. However, there's a problem here. I say up here, this passage must have been added by later editors because let's see what happens next. Everyone says during the 4th year of some ruler, and that year was 653, which was after Ge Hong had long died. So this is like an addition to this book. It's not part of the original book. It's like somebody's commentary. Anyway, these sores flowed from west to east, spreading everywhere between the 4 seas. So these people who had it ate some herb, Chinese mallow, which is not like a particular, it is a food herb, with finely chopped garlic, and then it stopped. At initial onset, the patient needs to eat it quickly. They should eat less rice and other dishes. Wow, you can use just some vegetables to get over smallpox? That's what it says. Then there's another one that could be Gohong because he lived around the 4th century. The question mark is not for CE, the question mark. This general period, there were a number of periods called the general period, but that's the one that's closest to Gohong's times. Anyway, so during this time period, this disease was obtained by contact with barbarian captives. So it was called captive sores. In other words, that have a war against someone and capture the so-called barbarians, and then all get smallpox or whatever this disease is. So anyway, that's the other. There's lots of mention of smallpox in the old books, but that's all I've translated because, well, I think knowledge is good, and even if it's not practical, I still like having knowledge, but at some point it's enough if it's not practical. So that's my discussion of smallpox and the vaccine, and I hope it's been interesting at least. Okay? Okay.